She came to her mother's chambers at dusk, as she always did, with her 3 small children gathered at her skirts, ready to be kissed and put to bed. She did not know that 2 men were waiting in the dark behind the door. She did not know that before the night was out, she would be made to choose which of her sons would die. And she did not know that long after the choosing, after the grief and the guilt and the slow unraveling of her mind, she would climb to a high window above a dry stone moat and step out of the world entirely. She was the gentlest soul the dragon's house ever produced. They broke her anyway. Born in 109 AC, dead by her own hand in 130 AC, at the age of 1 and 20, a beloved queen destroyed by a war she never asked to fight. This is the complete story of Helaena Targaryen. But was Helaena a hero, a monster, or simply the gentlest victim the Dance of the Dragons ever claimed? Welcome to Westeros Within, where we journey into forgotten ages, hidden legends, and ancient mysteries, heroes and monsters of Westeros. This is Helaena Targaryen, the gentle queen they broke. She was born in King's Landing in the year 109 AC, the only daughter of King Viserys I and his second wife, Queen Alicent of House Hightower. She came into a crowded and divided family. Her older brother was Aegon, born 2 years before her, the boy his mother's faction hoped would one day be king. Younger than Helaena came Aemon, fierce and proud and hungry, and youngest of all came Daeron, the gentle one fostered away in Old Town. And standing apart from them all was the king's elder daughter by his first marriage, the Princess Rhaenyra, named heir to the Iron Throne, the great rival whose war would one day swallow Helaena whole. So Helaena was born a Targaryen of the old blood, silver of hair and purple of eye, a daughter of the dragon. And from the beginning, she was unlike the rest of her ambitious, sharp-edged kin, for Helaena was sweet. The histories that survive paint her plainly and without flattery. When she came to be wed, the chroniclers wrote that she was plumper than most Targaryens and less striking than her brothers and sister, less beautiful than her blood was said to be. But in the same breath, they wrote something kinder, and it is the truest thing anyone ever recorded of her. She was a pleasant, happy, good-natured girl, and all who knew her agreed that she would make an excellent mother. In a family of schemers and warriors and would-be kings, here was a child who simply wanted to be loved, and to love in return. By the age of 11, she was a dragon rider. She claimed and bonded a great she-dragon named Dreamfyre, a pale blue beast marked with silver, one of the older dragons then living, and to fly upon her was said to be the greatest joy of Helaena's young life. Hold that dragon in your mind. We will return to her at the very end, in the strangest and most haunting moment of this entire tale. And here we must pause and be honest, as the histories demand. For some of you will have heard a different Helaena, a strange and dreaming Helaena who saw true visions and spoke unheeded prophecies, who whispered riddles about beasts beneath the boards and an eye that would close. A girl forever lost in her own faraway thoughts. Set that aside. That Helaena belongs to other tellings, not to the true histories of fire and blood. The chronicles that record her life give her no prophetic gift at all, and no eerie strangeness either. The Helaena of the histories was the very opposite of distant. She was sociable and warm, charming and kind, beloved by the small folk of King's Landing above any royal of her day. We tell her story as the histories tell it, and the histories give her no prophecy and no oddness, only sweetness and a gentle, loving heart. In the year 120 AC, when she was just 13 years old, Helaena was married to her older brother Aegon, then a youth of 15, by the command of their father, the king. It was done in keeping with the ancient Valyrian custom of the dragon lords, brother wed to sister, to keep the blood pure. Helaena had no say in it, as no princess ever did. The marriage was made for her, and it was not a happy one. For Aegon was, by every account, a poor husband. Idle, sulky, hungry for wine and feasts and the beds of other women, he was unfaithful to his gentle sister-wife from the very start. The fool called Mushroom, whose tongue was ever the filthiest in the realm, claimed that in the very same year Helaena bore Aegon's children, he fathered 2 bastards on other women. One, Mushroom said, on a girl whose maidenhead Aegon won at an auction in the Street of Silk. The other on one of his own mother's serving girls. We need not believe every word a fool tells, but this much the soberer histories agree upon. Aegon neglected Helaena, and she deserved far better than the man she was given. Yet whatever her husband was, Helaena found her purpose, and it was the thing the histories had always promised of her. She became a mother. Barely a year after the wedding, in 123 AC, she bore Aegon twins, a boy and a girl. The boy they named Jaehaerys, and as the eldest son of the king's eldest son, he stood in time as heir to the throne itself. The girl they named Jaehaera. And 4 years later, in 127 AC, Helaena bore a third child, another son, a little boy named Maelor. Remember that name above all the others. The name Maelor is the dark heart of this story, and it is the name that will, in the end, drive his mother out of a high window to her death. Helaena loved her children with her whole gentle soul. She was no distant royal mother handing her babes to wet nurses and servants. She kept them close. And she had one tender custom that the histories record, a small and loving habit that would become the instrument of the greatest horror of her life. Every evening at dusk, Helaena would gather all 3 of her children and bring them to her own mother's chambers, to Queen Alicent's rooms in the Tower of the Hand, to say goodnight before bed. Hold that image. The gentle mother, her 3 small children, the soft hour of dusk, the bedtime visit to grandmother's rooms. It was the sweetest ritual in the whole of the Red Keep. And there were men in the realm who would learn of it, and use it, and turn it into a nightmare. For the storm was gathering over House Targaryen, and Helaena, who wanted nothing but to love her children, stood directly in its path. In the year 129 AC, King Viserys I died, and before his body was cold, Helaena's mother and grandfather moved to crown her husband Aegon king, setting aside the Princess Rhaenyra, whom the old king had named his heir. The realm split in 2, into greens and blacks, and the dragons went to war. They would call it the Dance of the Dragons, and Helaena, who had never sought a crown, was made queen of the 7 kingdoms, sister-wife to a king she did not love, mother to the boy now named heir to the Iron Throne. There is a small dispute the histories preserve about that crowning, and it is worth the telling, for it shows the husband Helaena was bound to. When the queen's men went to fetch Aegon to be crowned, they did not find him in the rooms he shared with Helaena. Where they did find him, the chroniclers cannot agree. Grand Maester Munken, in his measured way, writes only that the prince was found at his revels. The fool Mushroom claims those revels were in a rat pit down in Flea Bottom, where Aegon was being pleasured by a young girl. And the pious Septon Eustace says he was found abed with a well-kept paramour, the daughter of a wealthy trader. 3 tellings, 3 different beds, and not one of them Helaena's. Such was the man she was wed to. So Helaena was a queen now, but her crown bought her nothing but sorrow. For the war that her family had begun would come, swift and merciless, for her children. And here the legend turns to its darkest hour. I will speak of it carefully, for it is among the cruelest deeds in all the histories, and I will give you the dread of it, without dwelling on the horror. Across the realm, the war had already drawn blood from both sides. Rhaenyra's young son Viserys had been killed in the skies over Storm's End by Helaena's own brother Aemond, and so the Princess Rhaenyra's husband, Prince Daemon Targaryen, swore a terrible vengeance. An eye for an eye, he said, a son for a son. Through an agent of his, a woman called Mysaria, the White Worm, Daemon hired 2 men to creep into the Red Keep and to take the life of one of King Aegon's sons. The histories remember those 2 men by their grim work names alone. Blood, a brute who had once worn a gold cloak, and Cheese, a rat catcher who knew every hidden passage and forgotten tunnel beneath the castle. And Cheese knew the way to Queen Alicent's chambers in the Tower of the Hand. You know already what hour they chose. They chose dusk. They knew the gentle custom, the bedtime visit, the mother and her 3 small children. And so, as she always did, Helaena came to her mother's rooms at the close of day. Her little ones gathered around her, never knowing that 2 killers waited in the dark. They barred the door behind her. Her guardsmen did not survive the next moments, and then the men seized hold of her youngest, little Maelor, 2 years old, and they told the weeping queen a thing no mother should ever hear. They had come, they said, to collect a debt, a son for a son, and she must choose which of her boys would die. Helaena begged them. She offered them her own life in place of her children's. They refused her. It had to be a boy, they said. It had to be a son. And then they pressed her harder still, warning her to choose quickly, before they grew bored and turned their cruelty upon her little daughter Jaehaera instead. And so, weeping, broken, with no good answer in all the world, Helaena named her youngest. She named Maelor, the 2-year-old, perhaps because he was too small to understand what was being said over his head, perhaps because a mother forced to such a choice could only reach for the child least able to know his own doom. But the men had never meant to honor her choice. It was a game, and the cruelty was the whole of it. One of them leaned close to little Maelor and told the boy that his own mother had just chosen him to die. And then they spared Maelor, and they killed her eldest son instead. Jaehaerys, the heir to the throne, a small boy, still. He did not live out that night, so they took from her the child she had not named, and they left her the child she had. And they left her the words. They left her forever knowing that she had spoken her baby's name into that room, and that her baby had heard it. The killers fled through the hidden passages, and Helaena Targaryen was never whole again. In the bitter aftermath, the king took little Maelor from her arms and gave him to Queen Alicent to raise as her own, for Helaena could no longer bear even to look upon the boy. To see his face was to hear herself name him to die. The child she had tried, in her terror, to save became the thing she could not endure to behold. The histories preserve one cruel disagreement even about that night's grim trophy. When the deed reached the ears of the Princess Rhaenyra, what did she do? Mushroom claims she wept at the sight of the murdered child. Septon Eustace says she smiled and ordered the boy's remains given to the fire in the Targaryen way. We cannot know. The chroniclers never could agree on whether the woman whose vengeance this was felt grief or satisfaction. That is the way of these histories. Even the simplest human truths are lost in the quarrel of those who wrote them down. But for Helaena, there was no dispute. There was only the long descent. She began to come apart. She refused to eat. She refused to bathe. She would not leave her chambers, and she would not look upon Maelor. She and Aegon, never close, now slept apart entirely and shared no more comfort. When her husband the king was burned and broken nearly to death in battle at a place called Rook's Rest, Helaena did not so much as go to him. She had nothing left to give. The Histories, which had once called her the sweet and good-natured girl who would make an excellent mother, now called her by a different name, the Mad Queen Helaena. The war had reached into her bedtime ritual and her mother's chambers, and it had hollowed her out from the inside. And still the war was not finished taking from her. In the early days of 130 AC, the city fell. Rhaenyra's dragons appeared in the sky over King's Landing, and the Greens broke. King Aegon, crippled and burned, was smuggled out of the city in secret by the club-footed Lord Larys Strong, carried away through a hidden passage in Maegor's Holdfast, and he took the two surviving children, Jaehaera and Maelor, with him. When Rhaenyra's men broke into the king's apartments, they found nothing but an empty bed and a fouled chamber pot. The king had vanished, but Helaena had not. They found her locked in her own bedchamber, and they took her captive. She became a prisoner of the very war her family had begun, confined within the upper floors of Maegor's Holdfast, the great keep within a keep at the heart of the Red Keep, held now by the woman whose vengeance had cost Helaena her firstborn son. And then came the final blow. Little Maelor, the boy she had named, the boy she could not bear to look upon, was being carried to safety by a knight of the Kingsguard, away from the falling capital. But at a place called Bitterbridge, the child was recognized by an angry mob, and in the chaos and the clamor, he was lost. He did not survive. Of exactly how he died, the Histories give 3 ugly and contradictory accounts, and I will not lay them out, for the child was 3 years old, and the manner of it adds only horror, not truth. It is enough to say that the mob took him, and that little Maelor was gone. So now both of Helaena's sons were dead, the one she had named and the one the killers had taken in his place. Her firstborn murdered in her mother's chambers, her youngest torn from her by a frightened crowd. Only her daughter Jaehaera remained, far from her, and Helaena herself was a captive in the upper rooms of Maegor's Holdfast, mad with grief, alone. She did not last much longer. On the 22nd day of the 5th moon of the year 130 AC, only days after a great battle was fought above the lake called the God's Eye, Helaena Targaryen went to the window of her chamber in the high floors of Maegor's Holdfast. Below that window lay the dry moat, lined with its long iron spikes, and the gentle queen, who had wanted nothing in all her life but to love her children and to fly her dragon, stepped out into the air. She was 21 years old. I will not describe her end. The Histories do, and they are merciless about it, but we need not be. It is enough to know that she did not survive the fall, and that she did not suffer it long. The gentlest soul the dragon's house ever made was gone, broken at the last by a war she never wanted, in a castle that had become her prison, mourning 2 small sons she could not save. Now hear the strangest thing in all of this story, the thing that, true or not, the Histories set down, and that has haunted every teller since. Miles away across the city, chained and half-blind in the great pit upon the hill of Rhaenys, Helaena's dragon Dreamfyre had sat through all the long months of her rider's grief and madness, unridden, sinking into a wretched state of her own. And in the very moment that Helaena fell, the histories tell us, Dreamfyre suddenly stirred. The pale blue she-dragon rose up in her chains and snapped two of them, and let out a roar so terrible that it shook the whole of the dragon pit. As though some thread that ran between the dying queen and her grieving dragon had been pulled taut at the instant it broke. As though Dreamfyre had felt her rider leave the world. It was not the dragon's end, but it was near. Before that same year was out, when an enraged mob stormed the dragon pit, Dreamfyre would break loose half-blind and maddened, and rise into the great dome above, and the dome would crack, and half of it come crashing down, crushing the dragon and her attackers together beneath tons of stone. The queen and her dragon, who had once known the greatest joy of flight together, were ended within months of one another, both of them victims of the same merciless war. Helaena left behind only her daughter, Jaehaera, the little girl who had survived that night in her grandmother's chambers. In time to seal the peace at the end of the war, Jaehaera would be wed to Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son, the joining of the two broken halves of the dragon's house. But Jaehaera, too, would be dead within a few short years, and so the line of gentle Helaena guttered out almost entirely, snuffed like a candle in the dark. The histories cannot even agree on what it was that drove her to that final window. And this is the last great disagreement of her life, the one the chroniclers wrestle with hardest of all. The Fool Mushroom tells the ugliest tale, a story that Helaena had been sold by Rhaenyra and the White Worm into a brothel in Flea Bottom, degraded and ruined, and that despair drove her to her death. But the histories themselves reject this. The chronicler who weighs all these accounts dismisses Mushroom's brothel tale outright as a fool's invention. Grand Maester Munkin offers something soberer. He proposes that Helaena was driven to it by horror, having seen two men hanged from the walls of the Red Keep that very day. But this too the histories doubt, for there is no evidence Helaena ever witnessed any such hanging, and she knew the two men, if at all, only as her jailers. And Septon Eustace gives the explanation that rings the most true and the most cruel. He says that on that very night, the White Worm chose to come to Helaena and to tell her at last of Maelor's death and exactly how the boy had died, and that this final grief, the loss of the very son she had once named to die, broke what little was left of her. Even here the careful chronicler hesitates, for he cannot say what reason the White Worm would have had to do such a thing. So we are left, as so often, with three tellings and no certainty. But there is one voice that cuts through all the in-world quarrel. For the author of these tales, George of our own world, the man who set down the whole bloody history of the dragons, has said plainly what drove Helaena out that window. It was grief. It was guilt. It was the news of little Maelor's death, the son she had named in that dark room, the son she could not save and could not look upon, the son the mob had torn from the world. When she learned that he too was gone, there was nothing left in her to hold her in this life, and she let go. So we come, as we always do, to the question: was Helaena Targaryen a hero, a monster, or a victim? Let the histories speak and listen to what they say. They do not accuse her. In all the slander and quarrel of Mushroom and Eustace and Munkin, in all the contradictions of who wept and who smiled and how each child died, there is no chronicler who calls Helaena cruel. There is none who names her ambition, none who lays a single death at her feet. She schemed for no crown. She fed no one to a dragon. She lifted no sword and lit no fire. She wanted only to fly her pale blue dragon, and to love 3 small children, and to bring them to her mother's rooms at dusk, to be kissed goodnight. She was the gentlest soul that House ever produced, and the war her family made took everything from her. It took her firstborn in her own mother's chambers. It made her name her own baby in the dark. It took that baby anyway at Bitterbridge. It took her husband's affection, her sanity, her dragon, her freedom, and at the last, when there was nothing left to take, it took her life by her own broken hand at a window above a moat of iron spikes. She was no hero, for she fought no fight. She was no monster, for she harmed no soul but herself. She was simply and wholly a victim. The gentle queen they broke, and of all the dead, the dance of the dragons left scattered across the 7 kingdoms, kings and princes and dragon lords and warriors, perhaps none deserved her ruin less than she. From first breath to last, that was Helaena Targaryen.